Simon Hayward, a brilliant tech entrepreneur, seemed to have it all: success, a thriving company, and a trusted partner in his wife, Amelia. But when a betrayal strikes at the heart of his business and marriage, Simon must unravel a web of deceit to expose the culprits and reclaim his life, no matter the cost.
The moving truck rumbled away from the driveway of the gleaming, modern house. Its sleek design stood out in the quiet, upscale neighborhood: sharp edges, expansive glass walls, and a pristine white facade accented with dark wood. Inside, the smell of fresh paint mingled with the faint hum of newly installed automated systems. Sitting on the edge of the plush, oversized couch in the living room, Simon Hayward tapped a few keys on his tablet. Almost immediately, a calm female voice echoed through the house. "System initialized. Welcome home, Simon." He grinned, glancing over at his wife, Amelia. She was unpacking a box labeled Kitchen Essentials, her movements efficient and precise. "What do you think?" Simon asked, standing and gesturing toward the house. "State-of-the-art security, voice-activated lighting, climate control, cameras synced to my private server. This place is a fortress, and all custom-designed, of course." Amelia turned, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. Her lips curved into a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's incredible, Simon. Really." "You don't sound excited." He stepped closer, looking at her with a mixture of amusement and concern. She sighed, setting down a glass she had just unwrapped. "I'm just tired. The move, the meetings this week, it's a lot." Simon softened, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "I get it. But this is it, Amelia. Everything we've worked for. This house, this life, we built this together." Her smile returned, more genuine this time as she nodded. "You're right. It's perfect." Later that evening, the two of them hosted a small gathering for key members of their team. The living room buzzed with conversation and laughter as their colleagues admired the house. "Simon, this place is like something out of a sci-fi movie," one of his engineers remarked, raising a glass of wine. Simon chuckled. "It's not just a home, it's proof of what's possible when you're willing to push boundaries, the same way we built our company." From across the room, Amelia joined the conversation, her tone smooth and professional. "And let's not forget, it's also protected by one of the most advanced security systems in the world, designed by the man of the hour himself." Their colleagues laughed, and one of them, a senior partner named Alan, raised his glass. "Amelia, I think you're the real reason Simon's been able to achieve all of this. He's lucky to have you." Simon smiled, wrapping an arm around Amelia's waist. "We're a team. She's the reason this company doesn't get buried under a mountain of legal nightmares." Amelia laughed lightly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Just for a moment, a fleeting shadow that Simon didn't notice. As the evening wound down, Simon stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. The guests had left, and the house was quiet, save for the faint whirring of automated systems. Amelia stepped outside to join him, a glass of wine in her hand. "Tonight went well," she said, leaning against the railing. Simon nodded. "It did. We've come a long way, Amelia. I can't imagine doing this with anyone else." "Neither can I," she replied, her tone light but distant. She swirled the wine in her glass, staring at the darkened horizon. Simon glanced at her, sensing her detachment, but brushing it off. "We're unstoppable," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "There's nothing we can't handle together." Amelia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine before finally saying, "Let's hope you're right." The words lingered in the air, their ambiguity gnawing at the edges of Simon's mind. But he pushed the thought aside, too focused on his own satisfaction to notice the subtle cracks forming in the foundation of their perfect life. The week had started like any other. Simon arrived at his office early, coffee in hand, and settled into his ergonomic chair. His workstation, a sleek array of monitors, displayed a constant stream of system diagnostics and market trends. He thrived in this environment of control and precision, but today something felt off. One of his lead developers, Eric, entered the office with a grim expression. "Simon, we need to talk." Eric began, sliding a tablet across the desk. Simon picked it up, his brow furrowing as he scanned the data. It was a competitor's new product announcement. The specifications were eerily similar to a prototype Simon's team had been working on for months, one that was still under wraps. "This isn't possible," Simon muttered, scrolling through the details. "It gets worse," Eric said, his voice low. "They're pricing it aggressively, undercutting us, and the timing, it's too perfect." Simon's jaw tightened as he set the tablet down. "Are you saying someone leaked this? From inside?" Eric nodded reluctantly. "We ran an audit. There's evidence that sensitive files were accessed and copied during off hours. Whoever did this knew exactly what to look for." The words hit Simon like a blow. Trust was the foundation of his company, and the idea that someone from his team could betray him was both infuriating and unsettling. Simon wasted no time calling an emergency meeting with his cybersecurity team. The conference room was tense, the usual camaraderie replaced by suspicion. "I want answers," Simon said, his tone sharp. "How did this happen? Who had access to these files?" One of the analysts, Maya, pulled up a screen showing access logs. "We've narrowed it down to a handful of accounts. The problem is, whoever did this used remote access, so tracing it back to a specific device is complicated." Simon rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Complicated isn't good enough. This leak could cost us millions, not to mention our reputation. Maya hesitated before adding, "It's also possible the breach didn't come from the office." "What do you mean?" Simon asked, his eyes narrowing. "If someone had credentials and remote access, they could have logged in from anywhere. Home networks, personal devices." Simon felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had always assumed his inner circle was secure, but the implications of this breach were beginning to feel personal. That evening, Simon sat in the kitchen, his laptop open in front of him, scrolling through the access logs Maya had sent over. Amelia walked in, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. She poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter. "You're still working?" she asked, tilting her head with a small smile. "It's not just work," Simon replied, glancing up at her. "Someone leaked our data." Amelia's smile faltered slightly. "Leaked? That sounds serious." "It is," Simon said, leaning back in his chair. "Whoever it was had access to classified files. They knew exactly what to take." Amelia sipped her wine, her expression thoughtful. "You've always been one step ahead of your competitors. This won't change that." Her calm demeanor grated on Simon's nerves. "It's not just about staying ahead," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It's about trust. Someone betrayed us, and I need to find out who." Amelia set her glass down and walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You always figure things out, Simon. You will this time, too." For a moment, her words soothed him, but as she walked away, her nonchalance replayed in his mind. It wasn't like her to be so dismissive about something this serious. Over the next few days, Simon began to notice small changes in Amelia's behavior. She asked more questions about his projects, questions she had never shown interest in before. "How's that new encryption software coming along?" she asked one evening over dinner. Simon looked up from his plate, surprised. "It's still in the early stages. Why?" Amelia shrugged, taking a sip of water. Just curious. I know how important it is to you. The comment lingered in Simon's mind. Amelia had always been supportive of his work, but her sudden interest in technical details felt out of character. Adding to his unease, he noticed she spent more time on her laptop late at night, often closing it abruptly when he entered the room. Burning the midnight oil? He joked one evening, leaning against the doorframe of her office. Just catching up on some legal documents, she replied, flashing him a quick smile before shutting the laptop. Her tone was light, but Simon couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Simon's mind raced as he pieced together the events of the past week. The data breach, the access logs, Amelia's sudden interest in his work. It all felt connected, though he didn't want to believe it. Sitting alone in his study, Simon stared at the access logs on his screen. His instincts, honed from years of solving complex problems, told him to dig deeper. He opened a secure program and began drafting plans to install additional surveillance in the house. If there was something he wasn't seeing, he needed to uncover it. Whoever did this made a mistake. Simon muttered under his breath. And I'm going to find it. The quiet hum of the house was interrupted only by the occasional soft click of Simon's keyboard. Late at night, when Amelia was asleep, or at least pretending to be, Simon worked silently in his study. His monitors displayed live feeds from newly installed cameras, their angles carefully chosen to cover every critical part of the house: the living room, the kitchen, Amelia's home office, and even the main hallway. Installing the system had been easy for someone with Simon's expertise. He routed the feeds through an encrypted server only he could access, ensuring total privacy. The cameras weren't just basic recording devices. They had built-in microphones, motion detection, and algorithms to flag unusual behavior. If there's something she doesn't want me to see, Simon muttered under his breath, I'll find it. The first few days passed uneventfully. Simon's monitors showed Amelia's day-to-day activities, making coffee, responding to emails, reading in the living room. She moved with the same grace and efficiency he had always admired, her every action appearing normal. But Simon noticed little things. She spent more time in her home office than usual. The door closed more often than before. When he knocked and entered, she would quickly minimize her screen or shut her laptop. One evening, as Simon reviewed the recorded audio, a particular call caught his attention. Amelia's voice was soft but firm, the tone she used when negotiating contracts. Yes, she said into the phone. It's almost ready, just a few more details to sort out. Simon frowned, replaying the snippet. The phrase was vague, but it stuck with him. What was it, and who was she talking to? Over the next week, Simon noticed more subtle changes. Amelia had started using a new messaging app on her phone, one that he didn't recognize. Its interface, briefly visible when she checked her messages, suggested it was encrypted. One afternoon, Simon casually mentioned it. New app? He asked as they sat in the kitchen. Amelia glanced up from her phone, her expression calm. Oh yeah, some of my clients prefer it for sensitive documents. It's more secure. Clients? Simon repeated, keeping his tone light. Legal stuff, Amelia replied, brushing it off with a smile. You wouldn't be interested. Simon returned the smile, but his mind raced. Amelia had always been meticulous about her work, but this sudden emphasis on secrecy felt unusual. At night, Simon reviewed hours of footage, meticulously scanning for any anomalies. Amelia's routine remained consistent, too consistent. She worked, cooked, read, and occasionally watched television. But there were moments when her composure faltered. Once, she stood in the hallway, staring at her phone for several minutes before sighing deeply and pocketing it. Another time, she paused in the middle of typing an email, her hands hovering over the keyboard as though lost in thought. Simon began to doubt himself. Maybe I'm overthinking this, he murmured, leaning back in his chair. She's probably just stressed. I'd be too if I had her workload. But then there was the call. Late one evening, Simon's system flagged a recorded conversation from earlier in the day. Amelia had been alone in the kitchen, her voice low but distinct. "No, I can't send it yet," she said, her tone clipped. "I need to double-check everything first. I don't want any mistakes." There was a pause, followed by a faint, muffled response from the other end of the line. "I'll let you know when it's ready." Amelia continued. "Just be patient." Simon replayed the call several times, analyzing every word. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to reignite his suspicions. Simon began watching the live feeds obsessively, his work taking a back seat to his growing paranoia. He started noticing patterns. Amelia always closed her laptop when he entered a room, even if she was just browsing. She had developed a habit of checking over her shoulder when she worked late at night. Her phone was never out of arm's reach, even when she was cooking or reading. One evening, as Simon watched the kitchen feed, he saw her pause mid-conversation on her phone. She glanced around the room, her eyes flicking toward the corners as if she sensed she was being watched. "Does she know?" Simon whispered to himself, his heart pounding. The constant surveillance began to take a toll on Simon. He found himself questioning everything Amelia said and did, searching for hidden meanings in her words and actions. Their once easy conversations became strained, his responses clipped and guarded. "You've been quiet lately," Amelia said one morning over breakfast. Simon shrugged, forcing a smile. "Just busy." Amelia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Don't overwork yourself. You're no good to anyone if you burn out." Her words, meant to be caring, only deepened his unease. In the stillness of the house at night, Simon would sit alone in his study, staring at the live feeds. The cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, but the sense of impending discovery gnawed at him. "She's too careful," he thought. "If she's hiding something, she won't make it easy to find." Yet, despite the lack of concrete evidence, Simon couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had built his life on logic and precision, but now, for the first time, he felt like he was grasping at shadows. The house was quiet, bathed in the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Simon sat in his study, staring at the live camera feeds displayed across his monitors. He sipped his cold coffee, his mind clouded by days of sleepless suspicion. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, scrolling through timestamps, looking for anything that might confirm or dispel his worst fears. At 11:23 p.m., a motion alert flashed on the screen. "Backdoor. Activity detected." Simon frowned. Amelia was supposed to be asleep. He clicked on the feed from the backyard camera. A man stepped into view, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Simon's breath caught. He recognized the figure instantly, Victor Kane, his most relentless competitor, the man who had been breathing down his neck for years, always a step behind. What the hell was he doing here? Simon switched to the kitchen camera as Victor entered through the side door. Amelia appeared almost immediately, dressed in a silk robe, her expression calm, almost expectant. She didn't look surprised to see him. "You're late," she said, her voice barely audible through the microphone. Victor smirked, shrugging out of his coat. "I had to make sure I wasn't followed. You never know with Simon." Simon's stomach twisted. His grip tightened on the edge of his desk as he watched Amelia step closer to Victor. She placed a hand on his chest, and the intimacy of the gesture sent a wave of nausea crashing over Simon. "Relax," Amelia said softly. "He's asleep upstairs. We have time." The casualness of her words was like a slap. Simon watched as they moved into the living room, their voices becoming clearer. Amelia poured Victor a drink, her movements fluid, practiced. They sat on the couch, the same couch where Simon and Amelia had shared countless quiet evenings together. Victor took a sip of his drink. "Do you have it?" Amelia nodded and retrieved a slim folder from the coffee table. She opened it, revealing pages of technical diagrams and encrypted data. "This is the last piece," she said, handing it to him. "Now you have everything you need to beat him." Simon's chest tightened, his pulse pounded in his ears as Victor flipped through the documents, nodding in satisfaction. "You've outdone yourself," Victor said, leaning back. "With this, Simon's finished." Amelia smiled, a small, self-satisfied curve of her lips. "He'll never see it coming. He trusts me too much." As the conversation faded, Simon's screen showed something he didn't expect to see, something that sent a cold shiver down his spine. Amelia leaned toward Victor, her hand brushing his cheek before she kissed him. The kiss deepened, their bodies moving closer as they sank into the couch. Simon's hand hovered over the keyboard, trembling. Part of him wanted to turn it off, to stop watching, but he couldn't look away. Every kiss, every touch was a dagger to his chest. This wasn't just a fling. This was calculated, deliberate. She had betrayed him emotionally, physically, and professionally. When the recording finally ended, Simon sat motionless, staring at the screen. The sound of their voices still echoed in his ears. "He trusts me too much." His mind raced. Rage surged through him, hot and uncontrollable, but underneath it all was a cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't just about the affair. It was about betrayal at every level, his trust, his love, his life's work. Simon clenched his fists, his knuckles white. His breathing slowed as the rage crystallized into something darker, something more focused. "You think I didn't see this coming?" he whispered to himself, his voice low and steady. "You think I'm just going to let this slide?" Simon reached for his phone, opening a secure app. He began downloading every piece of footage, every recorded word, evidence, proof. He would need it for what came next. Simon sat in his study, the room bathed in the cold blue light of his computer monitors. His heart had hardened since the moment he watched Amelia betray him. Now, the man who prided himself on logic and precision was channeling every ounce of his intellect into a new mission, exposing Amelia and Victor Kane for the liars they were, and making them regret ever crossing him. Simon began by systematically reviewing the footage he had recorded. He labeled each file meticulously. Entry through back door, 11:23 p.m., couch betrayal, 11:30 p.m., document handoff, 11:45 p.m. As he watched the clips again, he found himself muttering sarcastic commentary. "Oh, sure, Victor," he said under his breath as the man smirked on screen. "Take your time getting comfortable on my couch. Need another drink, maybe a snack?" He paused the video at the moment Amelia leaned in to kiss Victor. His lips tightened into a thin line as he stared at the frozen image. "Well, at least now I know what that robe is for. Thought it was for me. Silly me." Once the videos were neatly organized, Simon turned to Amelia's financial records. Using software he'd designed himself, he cross-referenced her account activity with known dates of Victor's appearances. "Bingo," Simon muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Multiple transactions to an unknown account stood out, consistent, timed suspiciously close to Victor's visits. "So, not only are you stealing my ideas," he said to the empty room, "but you're paying him to do it. How generous." The next step was decrypting Amelia's private messages. Simon grinned as he opened a program he'd written years ago for just such an occasion, though back then he hadn't anticipated using it on his own wife. The app worked quickly, decoding the threads of her encrypted chats. As the texts appeared on his screen, Simon felt his stomach churn. "Victor, Don't forget the specs for the encryption module. That's the key to the whole system. Amelia. I have it. He thinks I'm working on a legal case. He doesn't suspect anything. Victor. Good. Once we launch, he'll be finished. Simon let out a humorless laugh. Finished? Oh, Victor, you're going to wish you were only finished. Simon leaned back in his chair, the pieces of his plan starting to come together. He didn't just want to expose Amelia and Victor. He wanted to humiliate them. And what better way to do that than by using their own greed and arrogance against them? He opened a new project file and began designing a fake set of blueprints, an advanced cybersecurity system that looked revolutionary on the surface, but was riddled with critical flaws. Let's see how smart you really are, Victor, Simon murmured, as he added technical jargon and intricate diagrams. You've been stealing from me for months. Now it's time for a little payback. As he worked, Simon couldn't resist adding a touch of humor to the fake files. Hidden within the dense lines of code were Easter eggs, irrelevant comments and jokes aimed directly at Victor. Note to thief, if you're reading this, congratulations on being an idiot. Error 404, ethics not found. At one point, Amelia knocked on the door of Simon's study. He quickly minimized his screens and turned to face her, masking his anger behind a neutral expression. Still working? She asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. Simon nodded, keeping his tone light. Always. Big projects, you know. Don't burn yourself out, Amelia said with a small smile. You've been spending a lot of late nights in here. So have you, Simon replied smoothly. Her smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. We both have our priorities, she said, brushing off his remark. I'll leave you to it. Simon watched her leave, his expression hardening the moment the door closed. You have no idea what's coming. By the end of the night, Simon had assembled a damning collection of evidence. 1. Video recordings of Amelia's meetings with Victor. 2. Financial documents proving her involvement in suspicious transactions. 3. Transcripts of their incriminating conversations. The fake blueprints were complete, and Simon had already planted them in a secure folder he knew Amelia would access. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling over him, but it was accompanied by a grim satisfaction. The trap was set, and now all he had to do was wait. Simon sat at his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard as the final touches to his fake blueprints came together. Every line of code, every diagram, and every technical specification in the files was designed to look legitimate at first glance, but hidden deep within the architecture were crippling flaws that would ruin anyone foolish enough to use them. Victor, Simon muttered, a sly grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. You want to steal from me? Let's see how well you handle a Trojan horse. He added one final line of code, embedding a trigger that would overload any system attempting to implement the designs. With a satisfied sigh, he saved the files to a secure folder, one that Amelia had already proven she could access. The next step was ensuring Amelia would deliver the fake files to Victor without suspicion. Simon knew her patterns, her habits. She couldn't resist a secure folder labeled Top Secret, New Encryption Model. Late that night, Simon intentionally left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went upstairs. The folder was prominently displayed, practically glowing on the screen. From his hidden camera feed, Simon watched as Amelia entered the kitchen, her robe flowing behind her. She hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the staircase, before leaning over the counter and opening the laptop. Hook, line, and sinker, Simon whispered, watching her copy the files onto a USB drive. The next evening, Simon pretended to work late at the office, giving Amelia and Victor the perfect opportunity for their usual covert meeting. From his live feed, Simon saw Victor arrive, his smug expression already grating on Simon's nerves. Got it, Amelia said, handing Victor the USB drive. Victor plugged it into his laptop, his eyes lighting up as the files loaded on screen. "This is it," he said, scrolling through the diagrams. "This is exactly what we needed. He's done." Amelia smiled, though there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "Just make sure it's worth it." "Oh, it will be," Victor assured her, his tone dripping with confidence. Simon leaned back in his chair, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. "Enjoy the show, Victor." A week later, Victor hosted a grand presentation for investors and media outlets, announcing his company's revolutionary new encryption system. The event was streamed live, and Simon, seated comfortably at home, watched the broadcast with a glass of whiskey in hand. Victor stood on stage, his voice brimming with enthusiasm, as he explained the supposed breakthroughs his team had achieved. Behind him, a massive screen displayed Simon's fake blueprints, slightly modified to appear as though they were Victor's original work. Simon smirked, raising his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's see what happens when a thief tries to act like a genius." As Victor demonstrated the system live, the first signs of trouble emerged. The software began to lag, then froze entirely. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Victor's team scrambled to fix the issue. "It's just a minor glitch," Victor said, his confidence wavering. "Let's move on to the next feature." But the next feature didn't work either. Instead, the system triggered a cascade of errors, each one more catastrophic than the last. The investors in the audience began to exchange skeptical glances, and a reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Kane," she called out, "can you explain why your system is failing to operate as described?" Victor's face turned pale as he stammered for an explanation. In the control room, his technicians discovered the hidden flaws in the blueprints, but had no way to fix them in real time. Simon laughed, a deep, satisfying sound that echoed in his empty living room. "I told you, Victor, you were never as smart as you thought." As the event spiraled into chaos, Simon noticed something curious on the camera feed. Amelia was watching the live stream from the living room, her face a mix of confusion and dread. "What's wrong, darling?" Simon muttered sarcastically. "Starting to realize you backed the wrong horse?" Her phone buzzed, and she answered quickly. Simon couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but her responses made it clear who was calling. "What do you mean it's not working?" she demanded. "You said it was foolproof." She paused, her expression shifting from anger to fear. "No, it can't be traced back to me. I made sure of that." Simon chuckled, savoring every moment. "Oh, Amelia, it's not about tracing it back to you. It's about making sure you and Victor implode together." The air in the house was electric, crackling with tension as Simon sat in the living room, waiting. In front of him, the coffee table was neatly arranged, but its centerpiece was anything but ordinary. A black folder sat at its center, stuffed with printed screenshots, transcripts, and financial records. His laptop rested beside it, the screen paused on a video feed of Victor and Amelia's most recent meeting. Simon's fingers drummed rhythmically on the armrest of his chair. He was calm now, but it was the kind of calm that preceded a storm, measured, deliberate, and deadly. He had spent weeks meticulously planning this moment, and now it was time to see it through. The sound of the front door opening broke the silence. Simon didn't turn his head, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Simon?" Amelia called from the foyer. Her heels clicked against the polished wood floor as she walked in. "Why are all the lights off? Are you feeling okay?" "In here," Simon replied, his voice cold but controlled. Amelia appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from mild concern to unease as she saw him sitting in the dimly lit room. "What's going on?" she asked, stepping closer. "You're acting weird." Simon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down." Simon, sit. The single word, spoken with quiet authority, cut through the room like a blade. Amelia hesitated, then slowly lowered herself into the chair. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to Simon. Simon leaned forward, opening the folder with deliberate slowness. He slid a stack of papers across the table toward her. "Do you recognize these?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Amelia picked up the papers hesitantly. Her face paled as she scanned the first few pages. Financial transactions linking her to Victor, logs of encrypted messages, and still frames from the camera footage showing Victor entering the house. "Simon, I can explain," she began, her voice trembling. "Explain?" Simon interrupted, his tone sharp. "You think there's an explanation for this?" He tapped the top photo, a freeze frame of her handing Victor a USB drive. "What could you possibly say to justify betraying me, Amelia? Betraying us?" Amelia dropped the papers onto the table, her hands trembling. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not what it looks like." Simon let out a bitter laugh, cutting her off. "Not what it looks like? Really? Because it looks like you've been selling me out to my biggest competitor and screwing him in the process. So please, enlighten me." Amelia's eyes welled with tears, but Simon's expression remained stone cold. "I felt invisible, Simon," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "You're always working, always focused on the company. I needed to feel important, to feel seen. Victor, he listened to me. He made me feel like I mattered." Simon's jaw tightened. "So your solution was to steal from me? To hand over everything I built to him? And what about the part where you slept with him? Was that just part of the package deal?" "It wasn't like that," Amelia pleaded. "I never meant for it to go this far. It just happened." Simon's laugh this time was cold and humorless. "You just happened to betray your husband, your partner, the person who trusted you more than anyone else? Don't insult me, Amelia." Simon reached for his laptop and clicked play. The living room filled with the sound of Amelia and Victor's voices, crystal clear thanks to Simon's hidden microphones. "He'll never see it coming," Amelia's recorded voice said. "He trusts me too much." Amelia's face turned white as the audio continued to play. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Simon paused the recording and closed the laptop. "You broke my trust, Amelia. And you did it for him, a man who doesn't care about you. Do you really think Victor's going to stand by you when this all falls apart?" Simon pulled out another set of papers, divorce documents, and slid them across the table. "Sign them," he said flatly. "You'll leave this house tonight. You'll take nothing with you. The company, the money, it all stays with me. And if you even think about fighting me on this, I'll make sure every single one of Victor's investors knows exactly where his revolutionary designs came from and who helped him steal them." Amelia stared at the papers, her lips trembling. "You don't mean that," she whispered. Simon's eyes locked onto hers, cold and unyielding. "Try me." She hesitated for a long moment, then picked up the pen with shaking hands. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room as she signed her name. When it was done, Simon stood, towering over her. "Pack your things. You have an hour." "Simon, please," Amelia begged, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can—" "No, Amelia," Simon said, his voice like steel. "You made your choice. Now you get to live with it." Amelia's sobs echoed through the house as she stumbled upstairs to pack. Simon remained in the living room, staring at the divorce papers. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened. Not just her betrayal, but the loss of the life they had built together. but there was no time for grief. There was still one more loose end to tie up. The night was still, as Simon sat in his study, the only sound the faint hum of his computer. His fingers danced over the keyboard, compiling the final pieces of the digital dossier that would seal Victor Kane's fate. The folder was a masterpiece of evidence. Screenshots of Amelia's betrayal, financial transactions linking Victor to stolen intellectual property, and the falsified blueprints that had humiliated him in front of investors. Simon leaned back, staring at the glowing screen. "Let's see how you like playing by my rules," he muttered. Simon's first move was calculated. He packaged the dossier into an encrypted email, addressed to a high-ranking contact at the Federal Trade Commission, a man Simon had once helped during a cyber attack on the agency's systems. The subject line was simple and ominous: "Evidence of corporate espionage, Victor Kane." He hit send, leaning back with a grim smile. Next, Simon prepared a second package of evidence. This one was less formal but equally devastating. It was destined for the press, journalists who thrived on exposing corporate scandals. Simon drafted a short, biting note. Attached, you'll find proof that Victor Kane's latest innovations are the result of theft, deception, and betrayal. His fraudulent presentation is just the tip of the iceberg. He made sure to include the most damning pieces of evidence: a screenshot of Victor holding the stolen USB drive, Amelia's texts confirming her involvement, and of course, the live-streamed humiliation of Victor's failed product demonstration. After a brief pause, Simon clicked send. Within minutes, the evidence was out in the world, ready to detonate Victor's reputation. The fallout was swift. By morning, news outlets were ablaze with headlines: "Corporate espionage scandal rocks tech industry. Victor Kane accused of stealing intellectual property. Failed presentation exposes fraudulent practices at Kane Tech." Victor's phone likely rang non-stop as investors, clients, and employees demanded answers. But the real blow came when federal agents arrived at Kane Tech headquarters with a warrant for his arrest. Victor was in his lavish corner office, furiously trying to craft a public statement, when the agents arrived. "Victor Kane?" one of them asked, his tone clipped. Victor looked up, his face pale but defiant. "What's the meaning of this?" The lead agent held up the warrant. "You're under investigation for corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, and wire fraud. Please stand up." Victor's jaw tightened, his mind racing for a way out. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what you think you have on me, but it's a misunderstanding." The agents exchanged a look. "We have plenty," one of them said, "including financial records, text messages, and video evidence." Victor froze, the color draining from his face. He tried to protest, but his voice faltered as they placed handcuffs on his wrists. The image of Victor Kane being escorted out of his own building in handcuffs was captured by a swarm of reporters stationed outside. Watching the live footage from the comfort of his living room, Simon couldn't help but smile. The humiliation was complete, but he wasn't done yet. Later that day, Simon held a press conference to address the scandal. He stood at a podium in front of a crowd of reporters, his expression serious but composed. "First, I want to thank the authorities for acting swiftly to address this matter," Simon began, his voice steady. "It's unfortunate that someone I once respected resorted to such underhanded tactics. But let me be clear, our company remains strong, our technology remains secure, and we will continue to innovate with integrity." The reporters clamored with questions, but Simon's responses were measured and precise. He painted himself as a victim who had risen above the betrayal, a narrative that resonated with the public. The fallout for Victor was catastrophic. His company's stock plummeted as investors fled, unwilling to be associated with a tainted brand. Kane Tech's employees began resigning en masse, and the board of directors voted to dissolve the company entirely. Victor himself faced a slew of charges, with prosecutors eager to make an example of him. As he sat in a holding cell, the magnitude of his downfall finally hit him. The man who had spent his career chasing Simon's success was now nothing more than a disgraced footnote in the tech industry. The scandal didn't spare Amelia. Her name appeared in several articles, linking her directly to the espionage scheme. She became a pariah, shunned by her former colleagues and friends. Job offers dried up, and she was forced to retreat into obscurity, haunted by the choices that had destroyed her life. For Simon, the storm brought clarity. He emerged from the ordeal not only unscathed, but stronger than ever. His company's reputation soared as clients rallied behind him, impressed by his resilience and integrity. In a quiet moment back in his study, Simon reflected on everything that had happened. He knew there was no undoing the pain of betrayal, but there was satisfaction in knowing he had taken control of his narrative and his future. The fallout was unrelenting, just as Simon had planned. What began as a calculated act of vengeance turned into a dismantling of two lives, leaving Victor and Amelia trapped in the ruins of their own choices. The apartment was a far cry from the luxurious home Amelia once shared with Simon. A single dim bulb flickered above her head, casting shadows on the peeling paint of the walls. Amelia sat at the small, wobbly table in the corner, her laptop illuminating her weary face. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clicked to open another email. "We regret to inform you that after careful consideration..." The words blurred together as Amelia's vision clouded with tears. She pushed the laptop away, letting out a frustrated groan. It joined the growing pile of rejection emails, responses from law firms, startups, and even small consulting agencies that didn't typically vet candidates so rigorously. But her name was toxic now. Simon's evidence, meticulously distributed, had made her unhireable. The charges against Victor Kane had spilled into every headline, and Amelia's role in the scandal was far from a secret. Her phone buzzed. For a fleeting second, hope flickered. Could it be a job offer? Or perhaps a call from Victor? She picked it up, her breath catching as she read the notification. Breaking news. Kane Tech assets liquidated. Lawsuits mount against Victor Kane. Her stomach dropped, and she tossed the phone onto the worn couch across the room. The noise startled her neighbor, an older woman with a penchant for gossip, who knocked on the thin wall separating their apartments. "You okay in there?" came the muffled voice. Amelia clenched her fists, fighting the surge of frustration. She had tried reaching out to Victor for weeks after his arrest, hoping for reassurance, or even some acknowledgement, but his legal team stonewalled her calls, and her visitor requests were outright denied. The realization sank in slowly, like the weight of wet cement on her chest. She was nothing more than a tool for Victor, discarded the moment she was no longer useful. Amelia buried her face in her hands. "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice hoarse, but the words dissolved into the silence of the apartment, where there was no one left to hear her regrets. The windowless interrogation room was suffocating. Victor Kane sat at the steel table, his back hunched, his fingers drumming nervously against its surface. His once impeccable image was in tatters, his suit wrinkled, his shirt collar damp with sweat. The polished, confident man who commanded boardrooms was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered figure. The hum of the fluorescent light above grated on his nerves as two federal agents entered the room. They carried themselves with the quiet confidence of men who had already won. One of them, a grizzled man with tired eyes, tossed a thick folder onto the table. "Victor Kane," the agent began, his voice steady. "You're facing charges of wire fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy. I'd recommend cooperating, but that's entirely up to you." Victor's jaw tightened as he glared at the agent. "This is a setup. Simon Hayward orchestrated all of this." The agent raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "Simon Hayward orchestrated it? Did he put a gun to your head and force you to steal intellectual property? Did he make you use stolen blueprints in your presentation?" Victor's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He opened his mouth to retort, but found no words. The second agent, younger and more impatient, chimed in. Look, Kane, we've got everything we need. Financial records, emails. Hell, there's even video evidence of you accepting stolen data from Hayward's wife. Victor's face darkened. He had built his empire on manipulation and deceit, always staying one step ahead of the competition. But now, every exit was sealed, every angle covered. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low and venomous. The grizzled agent smirked. Oh, it's over, Kane. The only thing left is deciding how much time you're going to do. Victor's trial was a spectacle. Media outlets covered every detail, from his high-profile arrest to the avalanche of evidence presented against him. Simon's name surfaced frequently, but always as the wronged party, a brilliant innovator forced to defend himself against corporate thieves. In the courtroom, Victor sat stone-faced as the prosecution laid out the case. The stolen files, the fraudulent presentation, the financial transactions that traced a direct line from Amelia's account to his. His defense team tried to argue entrapment, but the evidence was insurmountable. When the guilty verdict came, Victor showed no reaction. But as he was escorted out of the courthouse in handcuffs, his expression cracked, revealing the weight of his ruin. The headlines were unforgiving. Victor Kane, sentenced to 10 years for corporate espionage. Kane Tech dissolves amid scandal. Rising star of the Bay. Tech industry falls hard. Victor's empire, once a symbol of ambition and innovation, was now a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the cost of greed and betrayal. Simon's office hummed with quiet efficiency. The open floor plan buzzed with the energy of his reinvigorated team, their focus sharpened in the aftermath of the Victor Kane scandal. Simon watched through the glass walls of his private corner office as his employees collaborated on new projects. The company, once shaken by betrayal, had not only stabilized, but thrived under the scrutiny. Clients who had been wary after the initial fallout had returned with renewed confidence. Simon's ability to not only survive, but outmaneuver his adversaries had become a testament to his resilience. Industry publications lauded his leadership, and invitations to speak at conferences piled up on his assistant's desk. Yet, as Simon stared at his calendar, packed with meetings and engagements, a hollow feeling gnawed at him. Professional triumph hadn't filled the void left by Amelia's betrayal. At home, the silence was oppressive. He avoided the kitchen, where Amelia used to hum as she cooked, and the living room, where their laughter had once echoed during late-night movies. Instead, he spent his evenings in his study, surrounded by the hum of his technology and the faint glow of his monitors. One evening, Simon sat in his leather armchair, nursing a glass of whiskey. His gaze fell on a framed photograph on his desk. It was an image from the early days of his relationship with Amelia, a candid shot of the two of them at a company picnic. Amelia was laughing, her head tilted toward him, and Simon's arm was draped protectively around her shoulders. He picked up the frame, his thumb brushing over the glass. "You were everything to me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're not anymore." For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of it, the love, the loss, the anger. Then, with a deep breath, he placed the photograph face down in a drawer and closed it. The click of the lock felt final, like the closing of a chapter. Months later, Simon found himself in an upscale downtown restaurant, the kind of place he rarely frequented. The warm amber lighting and soft jazz music created an atmosphere that was both intimate and lively. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored blazer, feeling a touch out of place, but also oddly at ease. Across the table sat Lila, a venture capitalist he had met through a mutual friend. Her sharp wit and quick smile had intrigued him from their first conversation. Tonight, as she laughed at one of his self-deprecating remarks, Simon felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine enjoyment. "So," Lila said, leaning forward with her chin resting on her hand, "you built your own encryption software from scratch? That's impressive." Simon chuckled, swirling his wine. "Something like that. It's what I do best, solving problems." Lila's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "I can see that, but tell me, do you ever take a break from solving the world's problems to just enjoy yourself?" Her question caught Simon off guard. He paused, the wineglass halfway to his lips, as he considered her words. Memories flashed through his mind. The late nights hunched over a keyboard, the betrayals, the cold satisfaction of revenge. "Maybe it's time I started," he said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Lila raised her glass. "To new beginnings, then?" Simon clinked his glass against hers. "To new beginnings." For the first time in months, Simon felt a lightness in his chest, a quiet peace that hinted at the possibility of something better. That night, Simon stood on the balcony of his home, a glass of deep red wine balanced delicately in his hand. Below him, the city stretched out like a living, breathing organism, a sea of glittering lights that shimmered against the inky canvas of the night sky. The faint honk of a distant horn, the hum of tires on wet pavement, and the soft rustle of leaves carried on the crisp night air blended into a melody that was both chaotic and soothing. The chill of the air brushed against Simon's face, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, the kind that hinted at a storm far off, but not yet near. He welcomed the coolness, letting it ground him as his thoughts drifted through the labyrinth of his recent past. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the cold metal of the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The city pulsed with life, yet here, in this quiet moment, Simon felt like he was standing at the edge of the world, his world. The betrayal had been the first crack in the foundation. Amelia, the woman he had built a life with, had taken everything he thought was unshakable and shattered it. Then came Victor, the personification of arrogance and greed, a man who had dared to challenge him not through skill or innovation, but through theft and deceit. Simon let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, the memories swirling like dark smoke in his mind. He thought of the long nights spent planning, the calculated moves, the icy satisfaction of watching both of them unravel under the weight of their choices. For months, anger and bitterness had been his fuel, driving him to seek justice, to rebuild what they had tried to destroy. But now, standing here with the city before him and the past behind him, he felt something shift. The rage that once defined him had dulled, its sharp edges worn smooth. The bitterness no longer tasted as acrid. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Simon saw the possibility of life beyond what had been taken from him. Amelia and Victor had been ghosts haunting his story, their shadows long and oppressive. But tonight, he realized they no longer held power over him. Their shadows had receded, swallowed by the glow of the city lights and the warmth of his own resilience. They were no longer villains to defeat, they were just mistakes to leave behind. Simon raised his glass to the sky, his fingers tightening briefly around the stem as he thought of everything he had endured. The crisp air kissed his skin, and he allowed a small, genuine smile to curve his lips. "Sometimes you have to lose everything," he murmured softly, the words a quiet affirmation rather than a lament. "To gain something better." He tilted the glass to his lips, the rich, velvety wine a reminder of small pleasures rediscovered. The taste lingered, as did the moment. Behind him, the warm glow of his home beckoned. This house, once filled with echoes of betrayal, now stood as a sanctuary. The technology he had built, the walls he had designed, they no longer felt cold and impersonal. They were a part of him, a reflection of the life he had reclaimed. Simon straightened, the weight on his shoulders finally lifting. He turned and walked back inside, leaving the city and its cacophony behind. The glow of his living room wrapped around him, a quiet promise that the worst was over and the best was yet to come.